Let's face it, cyber attackers have the advantage. ExtraHop is on a mission to help you take it back. Regain the upper hand with security that can't be undermined, outsmarted, or compromised. When you don't have to choose between protecting your business and moving it forward, that's security uncompromised. See how it works in the full product demo, free online at securityweekly.com/extrahop. We're proud to announce CISO Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cyber Reason. CISO Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. CISO Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cyber Reason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Ben Carr and Tyler Robinson. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. In an overabundance of caution, we have decided to flip this year's Security Weekly Unlocked to a virtual format. The safety of our listeners and hosts is our number one priority. We will miss seeing you all in person, but we hope you can still join us at Security Weekly Unlocked Virtual. The event will take place on Thursday, December 16th from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern. You can still register for free at securityweekly.com/unlocked. All right, gentlemen, articles. Now, remember, I thought Jason was going to be with me when I pulled these articles before he got sick over the Thanksgiving break, because he loves the military discussion around leadership. And this first article talks about the triad, right? The leadership triad around command, leadership, and management. And I just figured he would eat this article up, but he's not here, so you guys are going to have to take over.
Well, I like the article, right? And I think foundationally, like the understanding that leadership is different than command is really functionally important. I agree. Jason would have been all over this article. I also think it was really interesting that they picked up on the fact that command wasn't going to translate really well to the corporate world, right? They recommended using the word guidance, but I think it's important to understand that just, we always talk about the difference between a manager and a leader, right? But there is that strategic side of command. It's not, leadership is more about understanding your people, right? And how to motivate them. But command is really, I think, a different topic, right? It's more about the higher level strategy and how to organize for success in a combat arena. And business is sometimes combat. I mean, it just is, right? We don't want to admit that, but I think that's a truism.
If you remove some of the corporate management that has to happen, and you look at, say, the military and the way the military command works, there seems to be a lot of difference there because there's a lot less worry around the execution, the follow through, some of the politics. So does that kind of change the dichotomy of how leadership inside of the military and management, even management in and of itself, like when you command something, it seems to be a lot different mindset. So does that translate better, or could you adopt that in the corporate world where command actually is more effective and efficient?
I was going to wait for Ben. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that there's an obvious difference between military and enterprise behavior, right? And how that's going to work. But at the end of the day, I think there are a lot of truisms there that I think people just don't want to omit our alignments, right? I think command isn't necessary. I think the misnomer there is it's not about giving command. It's about understanding that you have to have an overarching strategy and an understanding of how to execute on that to succeed. That to me is command, not that you're issuing commands, but at the end of the day, somebody has to make a decision and you have to execute on it.
Yeah, I think this is where some leaders struggle, like set a direction and then execute against that direction. I struggle with this some days. Just saying, right? Like command, sometimes you want command almost. Like you want a direction, you want to be able to execute towards that direction. And so when I think about command in the business world, organizations that set a strategic direction and then build the team around it to execute towards that mission, I have high respect for, because it's clear. It's like, we're going right. Let's go right.
Well, in the interview segment, Matt, you asked me like why CISOs leave. Like I think CISOs need to understand what the mission is, right? And then the people that are in your org structure, you need to articulate that mission to them so they understand why they're making the moves that they're making and pulling the levers that they're pulling. That's a huge problem, I think, in corporate America, where really like you don't know what hill you're supposed to take, and you don't understand like what the goal or objective you're supposed to accomplish is. So a lot of the tasks seem misaligned, or you just don't understand why you're executing on them. And that articulation of mission, that is command.
Right. Or you try to take all the hills, but you don't have the resources to take all the hills. So then you completely fail because
what's important. You need to know what's important. Yeah. 100%.
Exactly. Yeah. This second article, I love this article. They said a CISO does what? This is great, because we talk about this, right? We pull certain articles and we trash them because they're like, really? No, come on. And so this article is a similar play on this, where they look at an article, they're like, yeah, CISOs need to have an understanding of SMTP, DNS, HTTP, network routing, VPN, and other technologies. And the guy's like, yeah, no.
Well, look, I think that's a miss when you're being approached for a CISO role and you see that the JD and it lists these things that you're like, yeah, who are they looking for? Like, who do they think is going to run this? And it's an indicator to a mature CISO that they don't know, right? They just don't know what they want, or they think the role is super technical. And so there may be a lot of people just passing on that role because it's not there. And, the same thing happens when I think I've looked at what JDs that I've created before, or that other people have created. And it's this rock star, singularity that you're never going to find. You have to really put some thought into what you actually want in the role. What are the requirements? How many years experience do you need? Again, to execute on the mission that you're given. And if you can do that, I think you can find talent where you wouldn't have before. But people do certainly look at these roles. And I think it's part of the diversity issue. I've heard with regard to women that there's a much higher percentage of women who won't apply to a role if they can't fulfill everything in the JD. Whereas, a male typically will say, well, I can figure that out, right? And so that can be part of the issue too. If you don't need it, if it really isn't a requirement, why is it in the job description?
So how would you, like, if you're going to school or you're trying to get to that point where you look at all the CISOs now, a lot of the CISOs that are out in corporate America have come from either coming up in a business, had tenure, 10, 20 years of experience, maybe very technical, and worked their way up the management path. Is there an actual path to come out of school and begin to adopt something that is going to translate into a CISO role without that experience? We run into this with highly technical positions like offensive security or pen testers. Like, without decades of experience sitting in the trenches, you really don't have the capability to do some of those. And some of those are not skills that are taught, they're experience.
Yeah, I've struggled with this a lot because I've seen a lot of these comments on LinkedIn about how, we need to change the requirements, and what entry level in security shouldn't require, 3 to 4 years of experience with, technology. I'd equate it to, you don't throw somebody into an MMA ring when they've never had any combat experience, right? You got to know how to throw a punch and take a punch to get into the ring. Otherwise, you're just going to get devastated. And so there are things I think you can get into with no experience and be really successful at in the cyber arena. But there are other things that I think you do need some basic level of technical experience or exposure. You need to come from, a networking background, or you need to come from, an IT side, or, have some development security if you're moving into app security. Like, just because it's an entry level role in cyber doesn't mean it's a truly an entry level role. You may have had some experience and not be entry level developer anymore, but you may still be an entry level cyber analyst. And so I think that understanding of the differentiation is really important. And, I'm sure you didn't mean that, you come out of college and you apply for CISO role and you're successful. But I feel like sometimes that's what people think, is that you come out on a degree track and you should, be able to jump into something. I think that there's this concept of, gaining experience, journeyman kind of experience that gets you a role where then you can actually start moving up the chain in cyber. When I went to school, seems like yesterday, but it was forever ago. There weren't cyber programs, right? There are now some really good cyber programs at universities that I would recommend somebody could do. But I still think that there is a pretty successful path for people that just, don't come out of a normal degree program. I mean, it takes really desire, participation, and, wanting to get your hands dirty to be successful in this job. You don't have to have a degree. But I think there definitely are programs now that set people up for that.
If I think about my career for a second to answer Tyler's question, right? I think the one move I made early in my career that helped me was consulting. I went into consulting, and it was varied consulting roles that gave me that kind of base level experience. Because as a consultant, you can see a lot, right? You can see very technical things at the endpoint, at the network. I went into compliance and GRC through all those consulting roles. So it gave me a really great foundational layer of knowledge that then allowed my career to move into different areas. And if I'm thinking about coming out of college now, I'm not going to be a CISO, and maybe I can't get an entry-level job at a corporation, but maybe I start on the consulting side, and that gives you enough foundational knowledge to give you that stepping stone into an organization that allows you to accelerate your career.
I've heard people say help desk too, right? Like I actually think the help desk isn't a bad, it's not necessarily fun, but it's a good experience to get some different tech exposure, understand where I think a lot of people miss out. What are the pain points of friction for the user base? And it gives you an entry where you can kind of start to chart out a path of what you really like to do. And then, build skills and reputation on that side.
And then once you do that, then you follow these 5 tips and you can become an awesome CISO. Now, I got to preface to this, Ben, because the first 2, I read the first 2, I thought they were pretty good. Then I think he went completely off the rails for the last 3. But, okay, so the first one is risk appetite. Make everything about risk appetite. We talk about security as a risk management discipline. Think about risk. Fully agreed on this point. Then he says amber all the way. He says everything should be amber in your risk management program. Otherwise, you're not going to get budget and you're not going to make anything. Okay, I kind of give you that one, right? You want to see some green. Yes, amber's going to be there.
It's got to be balanced. I mean, that's right. Really, if you don't have balance, you're not going to get any respect, right?
Yep. And then he goes in, he says, ingest all logs. He gets pretty technical on this one and get everything. Okay, yes, you do, but data for the sake of data without a plan on how to analyze it, I'm not quite sure. Okay. But then he goes into this whole, go to conferences, talk about all the amazing things you're doing, build yourself up because your next employer could be sitting in the audience. I'm like, really? That you're really going to give that as a tip?
Yeah, I don't think that didn't ring true for me. And then, everything's confidential, right? Like just say everything. I can't talk about that. It's confidential. I mean, look, I think what the industry needs is more transparency, right? I mean, there are things that you don't talk about because they are just confidential to your company. But I mean, you don't need to oversell that. I mean, just have some transparency about the issues that you're having problems with. I think people want to see is that you're genuine, right? And that you actually do care about what's going on, and you're concerned about risk and you're balancing it appropriately. If you're not, you're just not going to be taken seriously.
Yeah. And then the last one is just the icing on the cake for me. The 5-year strategy. Don't worry about it. It'll get extended to 7 years and you'll be gone in 2.3 years. So it doesn't matter. Right? Really?
I don't know anybody who could plan out more than 3 years, and even 3 years is a stretch, right? Things change so fast. So yeah, 5 and 7 year strategy. This whoever wrote this hasn't done it.
Well, and he admits he hasn't done it. Basically, what he did is he says he's observed other CISOs, and this is what he's learned from those observations. So obviously, he didn't observe very well.
Yeah, not a successful learning experience.
It's a wide diversity of CISOs he's watched, obviously.
Not the successful ones.
Not the successful ones. And look, we've interviewed a couple of them on this show. I mean, Jim Routh was a very successful CISO. He does not. I mean, he would talk about risk appetite and other things, but trust me, Jim wasn't talking about some of those other things.
No 7 year strategy from Jim.
No. Next article: CISOs missing major holidays due to work demands. Did you miss Thanksgiving, Ben?
I didn't this year, actually, but I will tell you, this actually resonated with me. So I don't know if it's planned on the part of the adversary or it's just bad luck, but like I always tell my wife, like, we're going to have a breach the day I go on vacation. Like that's what's going to happen. Right. And it's happened to me before, not major stuff, but like, you're tied up on, 18 hours of conference calls. Your family's not happy that you're missing, whether it's just skiing or the barbecue or whatever. And it's inevitable, but yeah, it does seem to be time for holidays or major events that you're trying to take some personal time with.
Yeah, we talked about this. I mean, it's a stressful job to be a CISO. So, and part of that stress is, incidents happening around holidays that create more stress and potential burnout. But, that's also part of the role a little bit, as we talked about in the last segment. So this wouldn't be necessarily surprising that this is happening. Now it's 2 in 5. So, it's 40%. It's not, a majority, but it's still enough to make people think about, do I really want that role? Because this is what I'm getting when I step into that seat, right?
Yeah, I think anybody in the cyber role, like if you're running compliance, right? If compliance is being done right, then you should be planning ahead, and you're likely not going to miss stuff. But if you're on the SOC, you could have an event. It doesn't matter if you're the CISO or the first level analyst. I mean, you might be working through that event, and that's problematic. So I don't think it's anything that's a surprise to CISOs or to those in cyber areas that get impacted by this. I think some of us actually, we don't like, you don't want to miss a Thanksgiving. I think that rush of that, running the incident and working through a problem, like there's a personality type for that, right? Like you need to understand that's either what you like or what you don't like. And a lot of people don't like that stress and the anxiety and the buildup. And so that causes them to leave and work on something else. But for me, myself, I don't like events, but like I don't mind working through them. It's actually, one of the more exciting parts of the job.
Next article: how CISOs can communicate the need for both IT and OT. And look, what I think is in this article is how to communicate the need for security in general, not just IT and OT. I mean, this article is specific about information and operational technology differences, but I think the tips here apply across the board, because tip number 1 is educating the board, dispel myths and misconceptions. That exists for security in general, not just between IT and OT. So, these steps apply in a much broader sense.
Well, I think, I just feel like these themes like continue like week to week. It's the same stuff in a lot of these articles, right? And Tyler, I'm interested in your thoughts, but I know Jason would have kind of the same opinion. I think is that like it's time for us to stop talking about these things in silos, right? Like security, as you said, Matt, is across the org. It's a holistic discipline that you really need to address. And so I think traditionally there was always this challenge between IT and OT being separated. And again, because the CISO reported into the CIO, and so it was an IT silo trying to interact with something outside their scope. Where if you really elevate the CISO discussion to security for the whole organization at, again, I say, chief security officer, chief trust officer, chief risk officer, something like that, like it just naturally falls in that you'd want to have security be a foundational component of your OT strategy as well. If you don't do that, it's just a miss.
And I'm really surprised that this is barely starting to kind of hit the mainstream for discussions at the C level. Like, we've seen the convergence of IT/OT for the last decade. Like, this is not anything new, and it's things that have mattered for a long time. I think this article has some great caveats to it where, yeah, we do need to dispel some of the misnomers and really get people on the same board of don't overhype anything, but don't underhype anything either. If you're talking about IT and OT, typically the scary thing about OT is it's life and safety. So you run into that risk appetite for people's lives, which from a CISO level, you should probably have this on your roadmap, and these discussions should have happened 5 years ago. But if they haven't, then yeah, let's get everything out on the table and make sure that this is all on board, because really, you're right. The siloing of OT is why we're in the predicament that we are right now. We need to have less silos. We need to understand the fluidity of our networks and the overall holisticness of our security from all the way from OT to the personnel and people. Like, this shouldn't be a siloed out discussion where we're only talking about OT and IT. You've got personnel, you've got HR, you've got even employees and the risk of insider threats. There's all kinds of stuff that should be inside the purview of especially the C-suite and the CISO in particular. So the fact that these are just now hitting mainstream kind of indicates where we are with some of the siloing and what the effects of those silos are. With ransomware hitting these things, you start to look at some of the VMware attacks that are at the hypervisor level, and then you look at some of the things that those are controlling for the OT side between water and electricity grids, and what can happen with ransomware or even just general attacks. All of this combined, like, this is a very, very bad place to be if you do not have these conversations already going, and if you don't, you should probably be catching them up very, very quickly.
The key,
and I think the people who've been running these OT environments, they're not generally thinking about it from a security standpoint. They're thinking about it from an availability and uptime side, right? And so trying to get, where do you devote the resources to security, trying to implement security in that organization that may not necessarily know all the specifics about the OT side. But I have some OT background, and it's not that difficult to get figured out what you need from the security side. Or do you try to get the guys that just have no understanding necessarily of security and are worried about the uptime up to speed on security? And I think for me, it's really a no-brainer that you get the guys in the security side up to speed on the OT specifics that they need, so they're not impacting stuff, but they can really bring value to the conversation and offer a way to implement security in a way that's not going to cause problems for the OT side.
Well, this is what you were talking about earlier, right? Was like, this is a people skills problem, and you need to be integrating these people and having discussions. You're right. The security can get up to speed on OT very, very quickly. However, I believe OT can also understand some of the fundamentals. And if you can bring those teams together where there's frank discussions where they're understanding the problems with OT, and you're bringing teams together where there's collaboration and the fluidity between those two teams, that's essentially the CISO's job, right? That's the people person side of this, where you're integrating teams and facilitating the collaboration so that those teams can work together for the most efficient and effective means of getting to a goal or a mission.
Because I think point number 2 in that article summed it up best. It's about risk and impact. There's a security risk, there's a safety risk, right? How do you bring those up to a higher level from a risk discussion, a risk management discussion? Because then you're not talking IT versus OT, you're talking about risks, and you're looking at security and safety more at a risk level than a technology level. And I think that's the mistake we make, right? And so I think focusing on the business risk and impact is a way to think about IT and OT holistically, because that's where there's common ground, I think.
And I think that's outside just the OT discussion, Matt, right? I mean, I think if you're elevating, like, let's bring the risk expert in to talk about this versus let's bring the IT security expert in, right? Like that's a different discussion, right? So no matter what the discipline is, if you're bringing in somebody who's looking at it from a risk lens and able to think about it from a risk perspective, whether it's life and safety risk, whether it's security risk, whether it's risk to the business of, insider threat from an HR perspective, like, those are still risks, and being able to evaluate, make an intelligent decision about the risk itself. that at the end of the day is really what we're here to do.
Yep. And ransomware is what's been driving a lot of this conversation lately, Tyler, to your point, because of all the ransomware attacks and OT environments. So this last article talks about the 9 tips for an effective ransomware negotiation. But 4 of the tips have nothing to do with the negotiation. They're like pre-steps. And then he talks about 5 steps for negotiation. I'm curious, your thoughts on these tips around the ransomware negotiation?
These were actually really good, honestly. I've done a substantial amount of ransomware negotiation, and we went after several of these people. From most of the standpoint here, the tips themselves, being very respectful, buying time, involving all the people that need to be involved. That's general counsel, external entities, compliance, regulation, all those things. Those are all pretty fundamental, but they're also very critical. You'll see a lot of the people that do make big mistakes. A lot of the places that have ended up in the news have messed up or botched 2 or 3 of these in a very significant way that's made this a much more public or even a much more impactful negotiation. The big pieces that they've put in here actually would work fairly well. However, there's a lot of legislation, there's a lot of new law, there's a lot of corporate policy and politics that come into play here that kind of don't play into just a negotiation. So there's a lot of things pre and post that you do have to consider from organization to organization. However, from a general standpoint, these negotiation tips are pretty good.
Yeah, because you've seen some guidance coming out about not paying ransoms, and this actually talks about, like paying ransom. Like, yes, it's going to take me a long time to collect these funds, but let me start collecting and showing that I'm making progress against it, which would go against the concept of don't pay the ransom, right? Because it kind of is right in the face of some of these tips here, right?
I mentioned your thoughts on that because I'm not a big fan of actually paying ransomware, and I think from an industry-wide problem, it's just, the precedent it sets and the encouragement it gives, like it doesn't work out long term in anyone's favor. So I'm not a big fan of that, and I think, I don't know, like slowly paying out a ransomware, it's just this constant drip of problem that you're gonna have. Tyler, where do you come in on that from a
I don't disagree with you. I think one of the things that we run into that is often not considered is the maturity and position of a lot of companies. If you're talking about from a leadership point of view, where either you're paying the ransom or you're going out of business because you weren't mature enough to have backups, you can't recreate some of the things that were in process, and you're at a point in, we'll even take something as small as a local government, right? There's a lot of case files that can be brought into this where they have to throw out, 2,000 cases and start over from a conviction process, which they just can't do. And so there are cases where I think the ransom can take place and should take place in a very deliberate manner. However, for the most part, you're right. We're in a position that we are now with such massive payouts and so many different ransomware gangs because it is capitalist. It's a profitable business that is being treated as a business, and they're very good at business. They see supply and demand, and thus now we've given them so much money that they can buy 0 days and just ransom whoever they want to ransom. And now we've created this proliferation of really, really bad situations for companies that were in a much better position and doing responsible things. So I think you are right. We've put ourselves into a really bad position, and it's only going to get worse the more that we continue this path.
I think you touched on a point there slightly that, they say point number 2 here on this: establish negotiation goals, taking into consideration backups, best and worst case payment scenarios. I'm not sure if they meant this, or I'm just potentially could attribute it here, but I think one of the most important things that you need to do is actually run a tabletop with a ransomware issue and actually involve everyone that could potentially be there, right? Involve sales channel, involve, you got to involve counsel, you got to involve PR, you got to involve, everybody who potentially would come into that and understand, like, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to pay ransomware? Like, is our decision no or yes? And if no, like, let's know that going into a potential real event, as opposed to being surprised with that decision when it's not the best time to make that decision. And then, you can always change later on based upon circumstances or, heat of the moment, things that happen that, circumstances change. But I think the more you can prep to have defined circumstances and understanding of how you're going to respond and whose responsibility is and how you're going to react, I think that muscle memory, building that up ahead of time, is really the most important thing out of all of these. And I don't really think they gave it enough credibility here or attention in that, you need to prep before the event happens for the potential.
I think that may be one of the most important things that you do, I think, in 2022 is that tabletop. You're right. Getting everyone on board and being able to run multiple scenarios. This is where the military is fantastic, is they have an understanding of the strategic advantages of playing out multiple scenarios and understanding what they're going to do and have that muscle memory because they practice it and they've gotten a playbook or a run book, essentially, of all the different things that they can think of. Having someone at the leadership helm that can decisively blend those together and do these good things where everyone's practiced it, you're not going to surprise a PR person that's used to putting out tweets with a, hey, we need you to come up with a very good breach letter to all of our customers and spin it in a way that, we can still survive as a business. Like, that's probably not a great thing to throw on someone's shoulder. So having that practice, having some of those playbooks, getting counsel involved so they understand who to call, and then even your external entities. I wouldn't run these playbooks purely internally. I would have some people that have some very evil minds. Like, what happens if I tell you no, or, hey, we're going to now leak access to all of your information and not just the information itself. So kind of playing out some of those more evil scenarios that, the general ITs may not think about is also a very good practice to kind of get involved with these tabletops.
Yeah, so I think that's a key point.
Yeah, I heard practice in 2022. And if you need an evil mindset, I think Tyler might be available to hire. Oh, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me this week. It was fun. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. We're off next week, so we'll see you in 2 weeks on Business Security Weekly.